I spent 30 years as a human intelligence collector in the Army and Defense Intelligence Agencies, some other intel organizations. Then I spent 7 years doing competitive intelligence. And while I was doing that, I also got my doctorate in information systems and communications. And if you do the Venn diagram, it's my master's degree is in Asian Studies Chinese, so I'm a China guy. And then later on, I worked in China. I made several trips into China. I worked at China Target for many years. Worked a lot with FBI on dealing with counterintelligence cases involving China. And then in the academic field, I became very interested in insider threat. It was interesting because in my doctoral program, half the class was, the beeps and squeaks guys, the really smart, nerdy folks that, are really into the technical aspects of information security. And then there were the rest of us, the other half of the class, and we were the sock puppet and orange crayon kind of guys, but we were looking at the human factors aspect of information security. And all of these things that I just described tie into what we're talking about today. It's the insider, it's the nature of the Chinese threat, why things have been walking out the door with alarming frequency in recent years. So anyway, that in a nutshell is my background.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. I appreciate the quick introduction, and we'll talk about how your experience has shown and proven why people should be more cognizant of insider threats and how we neutralize those. Our second panelist today, as we continue this discussion about insider threats, is Mr. Johnny Collins, and I'll let Johnny introduce himself and talk about his professional background. And as Fred just mentioned, there's sounds like two types of people that are working on this. And Johnny is who Fred referred to as the beeps and squeaks kind of guy. So Johnny, we'll turn things over to you for a little bit about your background.
Sure. Thanks, everyone, for coming today. So I'm Johnny Collins. I'm with Mandiant. Everybody knows who we are about the incident response stuff that's going on in the news right now. So can't talk about that. I just got to preface that, but you can see our blog and all that good stuff. But a little background on me. I've been doing this for 16 years. I've built out insider threat programs for federal, commercial, large entities, all the way down to small companies, and I've been involved in a wide breadth, everything from working insider threat investigations with farms, all the way to large chemical producers. So, looking forward to today. Going to give my perspective as much as possible on the hands-on beeps and squeaks, as you will. Again, it's my pleasure to be here. So, feel free to ask questions as we go. Cheers.
All right. Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Fred. Well, let's start off with kicking off the discussion with this question. We know that, I think a lot of people know, we've got to protect our systems and our information and our IP from external threats, from those outside who might be trying to steal proprietary information, from those who are trying to access personal information for criminal activity, or for those that are, and we live in a global society today, for those from, state sponsors of terror that might be trying to do harm to our home country. But while we're always focused on protecting our resources and our assets from external threats, maybe it seems to be like it's a little bit of a later discussion about internal threats, because we think the people that are closest to us always have our best interest in mind. And sometimes we find out that's not always the case. So Fred, why don't you start the conversation with you? Share some of those examples, some of those reasons why we should be concerned about those who are closest to us, those who are inside of organizations, to make sure that those who are working with their data have some sort of way to we have some sort of checks and balances on those folks to make sure that our data is protected if a threat internally does pop up.
Right. Okay. When I went to National Intelligence University years ago, I had a professor. You'd ask him a question, say, "You want the 4-minute, the 4-hour, the 4-day answer?" I'll keep it short, but the long and short of it is, what we have to do, first of all, is understand that there is a threat, and it's not just something that is of concern to the intelligence community and the Department of Defense. That's 30 years ago thinking, right? Those were the prime targets back in the day. But now everything is a target, and part of the reason is because it's low risk and high gain. All right, plain and simple. It's very hard to catch folks, and when you do catch folks, it's hard to prosecute them. And the potential payoff for the thieving party is huge. Okay. On top of that, so you've got high risk, right? You've got the fact that we do, like in my analytical courses, for example, we teach about biases and and mental blocks that analysts could have that'll kind of skew the legitimacy of their analysis. And one of the problems is mirror imaging, right? Where we think other people are like us. And one of the things that I learned studying Chinese and working with Chinese, working against a Chinese target for 3 decades, 4 decades, right, is that people don't all think like us, right? So if you're in a setting where you've got sensitive technology, either on your electronic systems, or maybe it's your seeds, for example, that are GMO or something else. It's of sensitive information, proprietary information. That stuff can easily walk out the door. So if the first recommendation I would have for anybody in the farming industry, agricultural sector, is to not look at everybody as being the way you are and I are, right? The way we were raised. If we have time today, I could talk a little bit about how the Chinese think about us and think about themselves, which is directly applicable to the issue of why so much theft has been ongoing. FBI every 10 hours starts a new counterintelligence case against a Chinese target. Think about that, every 10 hours, twice a day, right? So that in a nutshell, that was a 4-minute version of the answer, but we could talk a lot more about it.
Oh yeah, we got 50 more minutes to discussion, so we can go forward. Johnny, when we talk about internal security, we hire employees, we have managers, we have rank and file people who we give access, we give passwords, we give digital credentials. We say, here's what you need to get the job done. Go forth and prosper and do good things for the company, and kind of go back to what we're doing. And sometimes don't necessarily always monitor what folks are doing with those digital credentials. Or sometimes we might say, well, you might not have the right authorization from a management standpoint, but we know you need to get the job done anyway, so we're going to up your level of access to our systems just so you can get the job done, and kind of lose track of what's going on. From a technical perspective, when we give people, employees or vendors or folks like that, access to our data and our systems, what are the things that we need to keep in mind as we assume that those people, whether they're insider employees or vendors, we assume have our best interest at heart as they're getting work done for us?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the biggest thing is, where possible, do what we call these privilege, right? Where you're only getting what you need to do your job. The thing that happens over time is people move positions, right? They go from this portion to another portion. An example would be if you're at a factory and maybe you're on the assembly line, and then the next minute you're working in research and that type thing, and you keep your accesses. So now you've got more access than you actually need, right? As opposed to having it, when you move over, you lose those old accesses. So that's a key piece. There's a lot of other things that I would take into consideration. You mentioned monitoring. That's a big piece. I mean, a lot of people are just outsourcing that type of work just because it is so time consuming. And also it keeps out that collusion piece, right? So who's watching the watchers is the thing you always hear nowadays. But, it's one of those things that it's very hard to prove, as Fred mentioned, that somebody is doing insider threat activity. And so you've got to have a lot of data sources, and it's got to be rock solid. Otherwise, they walk, right? And so it's part of too. What I always tell people is you don't want to fall victim, because it happens that way too. Like everybody talks about insiders, there's also the unintentional insider, right? And that's a key thing I want to mention is there's people they don't know that they're giving information away in a lot of cases, right? Maybe they're talking to someone who's friended them and that's part of another farm organization or something like that, and now they're sharing stuff that they think is okay. Well, that is not even the right person, right? Maybe you're talking to an external actor or something like that. That happens all the time. So, like I said, I would say it's a regimen thing too. Like it's a cultural thing. If you want to make it so that you're going to be as solid as possible, make it part of your culture. As soon as you start getting lax in certain areas, it only takes one mess up, and then somebody takes advantage of it. Hopefully that answered your question.
There you go, Johnny. I think you provided a great segue using the term culture. In the business world, I have been familiar with folks who have used the definition of culture as the worst behavior that management is willing to tolerate. That defines an organization's culture. So let's talk about the culture of organizations that you have. You don't have to divulge any secrets or any open investigations right now, but based on your past work, both of you, Fred and Johnny, where is it that you see that the culture breaks down in organizations that 9 times out of 10 end up having those issues with data and sensitive information walking out the door or being put in the hands of people that they don't want to have their information? What do those cultures look like, and how did they get to those points?
Well, a couple quick thoughts come to mind. One is you want to have good, like Johnny just said, you want to have good policies and procedures in place, right? But the problem is you also need to make sure that those policies and procedures are not only known and observed, but they're enculturated, right? So in other words, that you just do these things as a matter of course. It's almost like, learn muscle movement, right? That when you see something that doesn't look right, that you act appropriately when that happens, and don't just rationalize it away and say, well, if that was me, it would, I'm sure that's not what it looks like. Well, maybe it is what it looks like, right? A couple quick examples. Motorola. Now, this is not an agricultural example, but it's representative of the Chinese methodology and Chinese threat. Motorola, 2006, they had an employee who was an insider, right? And she ended up stealing like just gigabytes upon gigabytes of data from different systems of Motorola. Motorola had the policies in place that did what Johnny was talking about. In other words, you should only have access to certain information and on your systems, and you shouldn't have access to everything in the company. The problem was that policy was on paper, but it wasn't in practice. Second of all, this woman came in after she quit Motorola, and on the day she quit Motorola, she came into the company, went in, loaded up at midnight, shopping bags full of proprietary information, walked out the door. There was a security guard at the door. What do you think the security guard did? Open the door.
Yeah, he waved and said, have a good night, man.
Yeah, no. He got up out of his seat, right? And he walked over and he opened the door and said, have a good night. So the point here, and then look at the NSA, another brief example, right? Look at Snowden, okay? There were, and this is open source, unclassified information, right? 3 individuals at NSA lost their security clearance, their livelihood, right? One was an NSA employee, one was a defense contractor, one was a military person, because all 3 of them violated the policy of not providing Edward Snowden with their user ID and password that he later used to access unauthorized information, right? So the bottom line is the first step you want to have first step is you want to have an understanding of what the threat is and then put policies in place. But the second step, like I said, is you got to get people to know the policies and you got to get them to follow the policies, because if you don't have that, you have nothing.
Johnny, anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think you're spot on, Fred. I mean, yeah, you got to have, the regimen, the cyber hygiene to say, hey, this is how we should be doing things. And then you have to enforce it. The thing that I run into when I do a lot of these investigations is nobody knows how to talk to who. All right, so let's say it's the CEO who's bad. I had a CFO who hired me, and that was the insider. Wow. He didn't think he would get caught. Yeah. I had a SOC cert manager who had hired us and was suppressing alerts so that somebody could exfil and steal data. So there was collusion going on. I've had a lot of examples like that. And the question is, who do you go to? And especially when it's like somebody's brought us on to go do the work. I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to go up the chain until I hit somebody. But then you don't know where the collusion is, right, as an example. So like on a farm, if it's like 5 or 10 people that work there and everybody's doing different things, but this one person's doing some shady stuff on their phone while you guys are out working, taking pictures of things they probably shouldn't have, who do you flag that to? Well, they're close to the person who owns the farm. How does that work, right? So I think that's the biggest thing, is that cultural adoption is probably the key word that we probably should focus on, is making sure that everybody's on the same page and that it's clear how to report things. And a lot of the government agencies, they have whistleblower stuff, right? But you don't have that in the commercial sector in a lot of cases. And the last thing you want to do in some cases is somebody says, well, I should go to FBI or I should go to report it to this, because then you may lose your job, right? Because who knows how the retaliation could go. But that's the stuff that needs to be ironed out. It's something to think about, probably, to do for folks on the call, is think about that as you're going forth, is how do you communicate the different types of incidents? So that's all I would add.
Mm-hmm. I think building on that cultural discussion, what is it that triggers somebody to go from a loyalist, I'm here helping support the company, the enterprise, the business, the organization, to now I have decided that I'm going to go the nefarious route and become selfish and try to benefit myself by stealing information? What is that mindset like that triggers people from going from somebody who's loyal to somebody who's a threat? How does that happen?
Well, sometimes there's kind of there's a spectrum of insiders, right? So on the one end, on the far extreme end, you've got people that are recruited and tasked and directed to go work for a company for the express purpose of stealing information from them. So they're on one end of the spectrum. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got folks that may be opportunists, right? That they're not spies in the sense that they're not working for an intelligence entity. But what's happened is they've, for example, in the case of the person who was spying against Motorola, and also I'm trying to think of the other company. Well, all right, I'll talk about that momentarily. But in the Motorola case, this is a person who wanted to go back to live in China, work for a Chinese firm. That was her express intent. But what happened was she came to the interest of Chinese intelligence. They understood who she worked for. They directed her against collecting certain information, and like, you bring this information back to us, and we'll set you up to work for this other company here, this Chinese firm here in China, and you're all set. So she didn't think of herself as being, quote, a spy, right? So that's another part on that spectrum. So it's not just people that are directed to go into work for your company and steal from you. It's also people that maybe they become disgruntled, which is also a huge problem because of the information age and the access to information, right? It's no longer the recipe for Coke tucked away in a safe somewhere and 5 people know it. Now it's on a digital system, and people that are digitally savvy can not only access and perturb your systems and steal from them, they can also deny you access to it, you know, and do a range of nasty things. So bottom line is, you've got a pretty broad spectrum of people who could become insider threats that when they joined your firm maybe weren't. And that's another thing, is you've got to have some sort of indication and warning when people start acting in an unusual manner, that you pick up on it, number one, because if you don't pick up on it right away, the damage only gets worse.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. I mean, the motivations just run the gamut. And I'll say with COVID, it's really brought a lot of folks to become insiders, right? Budget freezes, shortages, and all kinds of things like that. Not to be able to move to another position in the organization, like promotions, because a lot of those are tight on budget, right? So that has driven a lot of things. But it's also the unintentional person, right? They don't know that they're like Fred was saying, they don't know they're doing something wrong, and so they'll enable either an external, you know, actor like an advanced persistent threat, or it could be an insider. Absolutely. But it does run that gamut all the way from that close contact, you know, stuff you see in the movies, you know, chalk on a bench somewhere to do a drop with paper, all the way down to that unintentional. It's got that big continuum, if you will. And so it's very interesting. It can be anything. It can be anything from, you know, it's for my ego because I'm not appreciated. It could be I need the money. It's a monetary thing. I just need the money. My kid's going through chemo and I can't afford it, right? Rather than going and getting help for that, they may find other means, right? So it just runs the gamut. It's not like it was years ago where it's like it's always the malicious insider. It's in some cases there's other triggers or, you know, motivations that might be behind it.
Gotcha. Fred, one of the things that you mentioned in your comments was we need employees, we need staff, we need vendors, so we go out and find them when we hire somebody. And sometimes we might not know that we're hiring somebody who is being put up to be a threat. As we were preparing for this discussion, one of the things that we've talked about, and we'll bring it a little bit closer to home to agriculture, is the national security implications that food and agriculture has to the national security of Americans across the country. Anything from our supply chains through the inland and intercoastal waterway system, our railroad system, our airline system, we're removing bulk quantities of commodities and input supplies to and from different places. How do we address the idea of insider threats from the fact of what you had pointed out of hiring in the wrong person and what they may have access to once they're already in? You know, because we think about a disgruntled employee like Johnny had mentioned. What if we accidentally hired the wrong person? One of the key examples that we see in agriculture, particularly at the farm level, is in the realm of animal rights / animal welfare, where we see known domestic terrorist organizations hiring in malicious animal rights people to get hired on livestock farms to actually commit very egregious abuse on animals with the intent to film that, to then go to the media and say, look at all the bad stuff that these livestock farmers are doing, but it was an entirely staged process. That's just one example that we see out there in which a farmer just needed help hired somebody who responded to a help wanted ad, and before they knew it, they had a whole media firestorm on their hands. How do we address that when we're trying to screen those who we need help from in coming into our organizations or businesses?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And part of this ties into the fact that was mentioned earlier about us living in the information age, right? And just the accessibility to this information that's out there and available to a much wider audience than used to be, and what people could conceivably do. So that's one issue. Another issue is you may hire somebody who's perfectly upstanding and hasn't done anything egregious in their life, but for whatever reason, like Johnny was saying, something happens at work and they make that turn, right? So the bottom line is you've got to recognize the nature of the threat. You've got to have the policies and procedures in place, and then you got to pressure test the system and people over time. And because what happens is, if you can't just throw a policy down on paper and then say, okay, I'm done, and walk away and think you're protected. Because what happens is a lot of these offenders are pretty savvy, and they figure out ways to work around systems and do things that they shouldn't do. So again, pressure testing the system and just periodically making sure that the way things are supposed to be done are the way things that are actually done. The other challenge that you have is, because we're talking about business, I spent 30 years in the government and the military, and the thing is, if we had a need, we addressed the need, and the financing wasn't really as big of an issue. In a competitive sector, the problem is if I have a head-to-head competition with a rival firm and I'm spending an inordinate amount of money on security, guess what? If that other firm isn't spending to the same extent, then they're in a sort of a relative advantage from a financial standpoint, right? So companies, in my experience, I've gone in and I've given them the threat briefings and talked to them, and I don't mean like the typical intelligence community threat briefings talking about spies in the intelligence community. I mean, talking about commercially relevant cases. So if I went in to talk about to a telecommunications company, I would talk to them about how other telecommunications companies were targeted and what their losses were. But even so, it's still hard, because you're going to have that CFO sitting there shaking his head going, yeah, well, if we do that, it costs X number of dollars and we don't want to spend it on that because we have a strategic initiative. We've got to get funding together for that. And people just have to make that mental connection and understanding that we live in a different world than our parents grew up and worked in, right? The threats are different, and the potentially catastrophic losses. Quick war story. There was a company called AMSC, right? AMSC made wind turbines, right? And their biggest customer, 80% of their product went to China. And the Chinese got tired of buying the proprietary software in these systems that was manufactured by AMSC. So they tried to target them remotely. They couldn't get access to it, because what they did was, AMSC was smart. They had their developer working on a standalone system that was not connected to the internet, and that's where they had the software code. So what the Chinese did is they went after, they identified there was an ethnic Serbian working in Austria, and they contacted him and recruited him and got the proprietary software for the wind turbines. Next thing you know, within months, the Chinese are now cranking out those systems with the stolen source code from AMSC, and they cut off 80% of the contracts that they had with AMSC, and AMSC, the company, tanked, right? So long story short, it's a paradigm shift. It really is, because we've got to think in terms of 2020 and not in terms of 1980, okay? Because threats are different, the risks are different, and the potential losses are literally catastrophic, as was in the case with AMSC. That company, I don't know if it's still around, but it almost went under and lost like 80% of their stock value in 24 hours because of the espionage perpetrated against them.
Yeah, Johnny, we hear a lot of our national leaders in the United States talk about identity or IP theft, right? How real is that threat? Because when we talk about what happens every day on the farm here, or our food processing and manufacturing plants, we don't necessarily see that as a direct threat every day. What we do see are the implications of things like tariff wars and trade wars and things like that. How real is the threat of identity theft and that type of thing as it pertains to food and agriculture here in the homeland?
Yeah, so IP theft in this industry is prime for the taking. Keep in mind that this feeds the world.
Yeah.
Right. And then I always try to put it that way. It's everything from aquaculture to advancements in feeding people around the world. Right. We do that. Right. You think of just some of the large companies, you think of the small farms, even on like the Eastern Shore. Right. It's everything we do is tied in that area. I think the estimated number in this industry is going to be like $10 trillion over the next few years. Right. As far as, the IP value. Right. So it's definitely one of those things where every little thing you do can be stolen. And what people are doing, it's corporations, it's nation states, they're just trying to cut down the research time. That's really what it comes down to. When they're really trying to steal stuff, it's so they can get something out there and monetize it. Right. And we see a lot of that with corporations right now, especially, I've never seen as much corporate espionage as I've seen since COVID started, because people are getting fired. They're teeing themselves up for the next job. So what they'll do is they'll steal stuff so they get the other job, right? That's just stuff I've seen tons of, and it's industry agnostic, right? It's all across the board, but especially in this industry, we're seeing that. Everything from the chemicals that are used for crops to how you grow things faster, all those things come into play. And then solar farms is just hot. I mean, I can't even tell you how many farms that are around where I live in Williamsburg, where all I'm seeing is everything switching to solar. People are putting up like 4 layers of fences around those things because of the IP behind it, right? And then obviously for safety purposes too. But the point being, there's all these advancements we're doing in this industry that you've got to know where your data is and how to protect it. Because again, it's not just the data that you're trying to protect, it's how it could be used against you. Like if somebody takes something and leaks it, you've got no advantage in the marketplace. Right? If they take your custom, compounds or whatever chemicals that you guys are developing to help things grow faster, or make things grow in a way that's going to allow you to get more seasons, as an example, that's just stuff that could be, devastating to an organization, right? Because then all of the other competitors that are in your space can take advantage of it. So we see both. We see a lot of data dumping. We see people also just trying to give the other organizations the upper hand, if that makes sense.
No, absolutely does. And as more technology is adopted at the food production level, we see more in that. Part of our discussion was particularly in the plant, and we'll see more of this in the livestock sector, the introduction of technology like CRISPR-Cas9, in which we are literally using code to engineer the plant or the animal to produce certain traits in a much more predictable and what we feel in a much more safe way than before. But the knowledge that goes into discovering that is, the investment that's gone into that knowledge and discovery is huge. And if it leaks out, you've lost that investment and somebody else is going to be into the market and using that. So let's take us back down to the ground level. So we've talked about these threats and how these types of things happen. How do we start figuring out where we begin with assessing our current threat risks? If I'm a farmer and I've got a large operation where I am using things like drone and a lot of wireless technology and wireless sensors and lots of IoT on the farm, or if I am a manager of a fertilizer or a company or a co-op or a grain elevator or a feedlot, where do I even begin to assess what my insider threat risk is? What's step number one?
Well, it's interesting when you mention IoT, because I actually wrote a paper last year that got published. It was on the threat to IIoT, right? Industrial Internet of Things. So for example, fuel refinery would have a system that had been proprietary in nature. And then now, because you're adding IIoT connectivity, now there's potential access to that system that didn't exist in the past, because it used to be a closed system. It used to be not connected to anything. It was proprietary software by the manufacturer of whatever the control system was, right? So that scenario also applies in the agricultural sector, right? Because you've got integration for one thing. So what you want to look at is, how secure are the comms links, right? Between, if you've got an airborne platform, you've got drones out there, and they're communicating data back. Is that connectivity does that provide an ingress point for a nefarious actor, right? So bottom line is you've got to look at the entirety of your system, and you've got to put your bad guy hat on and say, what could I conceivably do against those systems? And then related to this, another relevant thought is, we talk a lot about the insider threat in terms of what an insider could do to you today. The other problem is what an insider could be doing is laying the groundwork for problems later on. So in other words, like computer network operations, right? You've got computer network exploitation. So you're actually able to get into and access somebody else's system. You may not do anything to that system today, but the thing is now you've done your reconnaissance and you know how you can go in and disrupt it tomorrow, right? So part of the challenge here is these things are not necessarily readily observable to a casual observer, number one. And second of all, if somebody has gained access and is just poking around and looking and doing a network reconnaissance, that you may be totally oblivious to that, but they may be leaving behind capabilities to come back and activate later on. And from a national security standpoint, think about this. China feeds 1/5 of the world's population, right? So that explains part of the reason why they're so intent on stealing agricultural data and information, right? But on the other hand, if we were to have a conflict with a country like China, what better way to disrupt the United States? You wouldn't have to use bombs and the things we normally think of when we think about warfare. You could disrupt our access to food, right? By activating some of these capabilities that are put in place now today in peacetime, right? So the bottom line is you want to have somebody come in, number one, who's knowledgeable about what your systems are and what your vulnerabilities are, and can paint a picture. And then you do your risk management matrix and say, okay, what's the highest risk and worst potential outcome for me, and what do I need to how do I prioritize addressing those things? Okay, and then what policies do I need to put into place so that if somebody is acting in an unusual way, that it comes to my attention and I can take a closer look at that.
Here's a question, Fred, you brought it up. I'll pose this question to Johnny. Fred said, go out and find an expert to help you identify those threats. And so often in agriculture, in the farming community, I hear this person defined as an expert. Well, my grandson understands computers, so I'm going to let him handle that. Or we know a neighbor kid who just got out of college, and we know that young people are good with technology. So I'm just going to find every young person out there that I kind of know and kind of trust that might be related, and they're going to help us set up our technology. What are the risks in doing that, as innocent as it might sound?
Yeah, it's one of those interesting points where we see a lot of that, where in a smaller organization, they'll just, find the nearest person to help out, right? And what I will tell you is you want experts if you're going to have somebody monitor your stuff. But the key thing before you even do that, it's kind of like Fred was saying, is know where your data is, right? Where are you keeping the sensitive data? Is there a hard drive on that drone? Is there a hard drive that you're keeping all this data that you're collecting? Know where that data is, and it's not just on the hard drive. Everybody thinks, oh, I've got, it's in a database, it's encrypted. Well, as soon as you run a report and you leave it on your desktop, that's something that an insider can just snatch and grab and will walk out the door with, right? So follow the data. That's what I would tell you, and find an expert, a third party where there's no potential for collusion, right? That's the ideal way to go. If you can't, find like an MSSP, at least something where even though it's third party, it may not be like the most advanced, managed detection response kind of capability, but at least it's something where, you don't have to worry about that collusion.
There you go. Well, why don't we see if anybody in the audience today, I know we got a few people on this call. Does anybody have any questions out there for our two experts, Fred and Johnny, as we talk about addressing and trying to neutralize insider threats? We'll leave the line open here for a little bit. Feel free to unmute yourself and pose a question. No questions. Not seeing any questions yet. So why don't we talk a little bit about maybe about what you've seen in the past. Again, not divulging any secret information, but talk to us a little bit about some examples that you've seen long ago and far away that turn into interesting situations or case studies that can teach us some valuable lessons. So either Fred or Johnny, I'll let you open up with a little bit of story time.
Well, one story that comes to mind for me, 2018, there was a Chinese individual named Haitao Xiang, and he worked for Monsanto. And he quit Monsanto one day, and the next day he was about to board a flight from Chicago back to China, to Shanghai, and he got arrested. And the reason he got arrested was he had stolen proprietary software from Monsanto. It was called Nutrient Optimizer, and what it did is combined big data and planting information, right? So proprietary information from Monsanto. So I don't know the full details as to how the authorities became aware of his activities, what triggered that, but just think about that for a minute, okay? That was an individual who had access to that system, whether legitimately or not, right? And was about to take it back to China. And let's say if he'd gotten on that plane and left and nobody would have been the wiser, this kind of thing happens literally every day. A couple of Chinese individuals crawling under a fence in a field where they had GMO seeds planted, right? And they were apprehended. And the problem is a lot of these cases, it's, I'd love to tell you that we have a really great law enforcement and intelligence system. We do, but the problem is that a lot of these arrests come about from just serendipity, right? Somebody being screened, the Motorola case, right? That individual was going to board a flight to go back to China and was asked by the customs, right? How much money are you carrying back? And she's like, well, because the limit's 10,000, right? I'm carrying 11,000. Long story short, she ended up being taken aside in the secondary and was questioned. And the answers didn't seem so good. So they started doing some investigation. And that's how the Motorola case came about, right? Because of serendipity. So this is something that is really concerning to me, because the cases that we're catching, right? You want to sit back and say, oh, that's great, we're catching these folks and there should be a disincentive. The problem is because of the way we're catching them is serendipitous, and it's not necessarily because we've got these really effective systems in place that are, all seeing and all knowing. So the bottom line is a CEO and the board, right? They're the first line of defense, right? Don't rely on the IC and the law enforcement authorities to do the job that really is your responsibility. So it's a painful thing we're talking about, because like I said, in a competitive world in the private sector, you're disincentivized to invest in security, because if you can go through the next 5 years and as long as you're CEO and then you move on, okay, and nothing happens, you're golden, right? But the problem is you are literally rolling the dice. You're rolling the dice by doing that. So that's the thing that concerns me when I look back at the way these cases evolved and why people were caught in the ways that they were. The first line of defense really needs to be the corporate leadership.
No, good point, Fred. And I'll just add a little bit of a personal story from I worked in the Fortune 100, and I won't divulge any names, but our general philosophy on maintaining facilities and systems were run them into the ground until they are absolutely zero functionality, and then we will replace them.
Right.
But I think we often those are when the problems creep up, is when degradation starts to happen to physical facilities and networks and things like that. And so maybe letting it run its last mile isn't the best policy to work with. It's how do we do preventative maintenance as we go along.
I have a question.
Go ahead, Mike.
And this may be unfair, but let me just throw it out there anyway. But trying to get things down to a little practical level for farmers, farmers are not always that quick to be early adopters of technology, let alone best practices, because they're busy doing what they do. Is there any practicality in maybe the Farm Bureau, if it were to take some kind of leadership role to how could the Farm Bureau maybe put together some kind of I don't want to say generic, but some kind of program or process or procedures that may be something that individual farms would be more easily able to adopt? Obviously, implementation is always the challenge, but how can perhaps we do this as more of an association or a group effort, rather than relying on individual farmers to take their own initiative in addressing these threats?
I think that is a fabulous question, Mike, and I've got an even better answer for you. And as I explain my answer, I want to let people know I did not pay Mike to tee up that question because I haven't even had this discussion with Mike. One of the initiatives that Farm Bureau and several of us in the Farm Bureau have been having is looking at the value proposition of membership in a trade association like the Farm Bureau. We've been doing extensive research over the past 2 years to figure out what the needs are of the farmer of the future. And let me be very clear, the farmer of the future, not necessarily the Farm Bureau member of the future, because we believe that if we provide those services that farmers need today, and more importantly, in 20 years from now, looking at the year 2040, that we will provide that need for people to want to become members of trade associations like Farm Bureaus. One of those, we've got several things that we've identified, but one of those in particular that we've identified is the ability to help farmers adopt technology on the farm to do what? As what we're always trying to do, maximize productivity and minimize inputs so that we can maximize profitability going forward. One of those things as we look at the need of a technology adoption on the farm are things that we're talking about. Number one, we know we can easily buy technology. It's easy to talk to any vendor or to buy equipment that can connect to the internet. It's not as easy to figure out how we should properly connect that equipment so that our data is safe, that our business is safe, and everything that we need to do to run our business is safe. And then thirdly, how do we provide ongoing continuing education on how to properly manage that equipment, security, training, and those types of things. Because once you have something, we know the need for continuing education is always there. So one of the things that we'll slowly be rolling out here in 2021 is part of what we're calling the Farmer of the Future initiative that will be in looking at how we change our value proposition or services that we provide to Farm Bureau members to partner with organizations like F3 Tech, like the technology vendors, and hopefully security providers and consultants to talk about how we better use technology on the farm and provide that education around responsible use of that technology on the farm. So Mike, you're headed in the right direction, and our board is having that discussion right now to talk about how we add that value, because there should be a place for farmers to get that information. And we think that if they go to a trusted source like Farm Bureau, where we can serve almost as a clearinghouse to bring all those interested parties together that we know are, and I hate to use the term here, but are safe, reliable partners. We've done a vetting process to make sure that we're bringing trusted partners to the table to talk with our farming community, that Farm Bureau can be a place that we grow that level of service and networking opportunities for our members.
Well, John, just a quick comment on that. So I have a friend in the maritime industry, and he does cybersecurity for the maritime field. And I'll tell you a couple of things that have been key to them being wildly successful, right? And I mean wildly successful in terms of being accepted in the maritime industry is because he's maritime first, right? So he understands what their needs are. He understands what the threats are, and he knows, at least in a conceptual way, what the systems are, right? So he can come in and have a conversation, a knowledgeable conversation. So the analog for you is if you've got folks that are knowledgeable about the farming industry and about the threats specific to the farming industry, you'll have a lot of credibility when you sit down with somebody and say, I'm here to talk to you about buffing up your security. So, I'm very encouraged by what my friend Alex has done, like I said, in the maritime space, and I know it would also be effective in the farming sector.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
Yeah, and I would add that where possible, cooperations amongst farmers would be ideal for getting services, so that it can be all centralized, and it can be an opt-in, opt-out kind of situation, right? You're paying for it, whatever that looks like, whether it's through grants or however it's funded. But those have been very successful. I've seen those in almost every industry where people are taking advantage of those kinds of capabilities, and that I think is the best way to ensure consistency. Because if you're using a similar vendor across the board, it's hey, they're maintaining the IT, and then you've got a vendor that's doing the security side of things, and then just auditors too. That's always a big thing, right? Like, I mean, I'll give an example. I went onto a farm and they're like, this is our recipe for XYZ. I won't say what it is, but they were like, they just showed it to me on a piece of paper. I pulled out my phone, took a picture. I'm like, now it's my recipe. And it was that eye-opening event that they were like, okay, we need to get services. They didn't go with us, which is fine, no big deal. But they did get a provider, and a reasonable one. So it's just that little eye-opening moment where, hey, the way we used to do it, like keeping something in the safe for a recipe, or the way we do things, it's all in our heads. There's a couple problems with that, right? When somebody passes on, it's gone, right? Unless they've got somebody to take it over. And the other piece of it too, if it's on paper, somebody could steal it, right? That just a couple of examples, but yeah, cooperatives is my recommendation if possible, is to get together, and that way you get that best pricing, and you get the consistent coverage and the communications that comes out of it. Like, hey, we found this over here. We won't say who the farmer is, but you guys may want to look at it over here as an example. So hopefully that helps.
Yeah, Johnny, and I think the technology aside, creating communities where people can share that information and share that experience is where we build a lot of trust and value. Is that when somebody finds out something and is able to share it to the rest, that benefits everybody. That's where kind of value is really generated. Right, so we got about, I think, Micah, about 5 minutes or so, 5 or 10 minutes. You let us know where you went ahead in this conversation.
As long as you want, till close to noon when people bounce out, and I don't know if anybody's going to bounce into the other breakout session at noon, or they're going to call it a day. But yeah, the floor is yours.
Okay, Fred, you had mentioned something earlier on that kind of piqued my curiosity. You talked about, let me talk to you about what interests folks in China, what the Chinese mentality is when it comes to their reasoning behind why they really want to get their hands on our IP. What is the mentality that's driving the Chinese model and how they interact with the rest of the world?
Okay, last November, I was invited by the Romanian Military Intelligence Division to come and give them a presentation on this topic, right? Basically, how the Chinese look at us and how they regard, what we consider theft of intellectual property. And the bottom line is that if you look at Chinese history, 5,000 years of it, there was a 100-year period that they call the Century of Shame. And that Century of Shame ran from the Opium Wars, which was about 1842 to 1860, to 1949 when the People's Republic of China stood up. And with the exception of that Century of Shame, as the Chinese call it, China they were the big dog on the block. I mean, they were the party, right? I mean, as far as global players were, they were on top of the heap. So like I said, 5,000 year history and 100-year anomaly of that Century of Shame. And the reason for the Century of Shame was technological deficiency, because even though the Chinese had a culturally superior culture, what they didn't have is they didn't put a lot of emphasis on technology. So you had Western powers that came in and the Japanese invasions, and it was a mess, right? So what's significant is when Mao Zedong established the People's Republic of China, 1st of October of 1949, and he stood there on that platform in Beijing and he said, the Chinese people have stood up, okay? Now let's fast forward to 2017, right? Xi Jinping, and he gets renewed as the General Secretary of the Communist Party. And what he said was, the Chinese people have stood up and we're moving towards center stage, right? And what that means is they're not only standing up and becoming the technological equal of the West, but they've got very, very global strategic ambitions, right? But understand too that in China, they've got you go to Beijing or Shanghai or Hong Kong and other cities on the mainland, and you'll be blown away by how advanced China has become. You go out into the countryside, not so much, right? But that's what their agriculture is, right? So that's one facet. They've got, like I said, they feed 1/5 of the world, and they want to be as efficient as humanly possible. But from the Chinese perspective, they feel that the West, the international law and all the norms that we've established, right, are things that because we were in an advantageous position. So in other words, we in the West were basically out there doing all these nefarious things to the Chinese for 100 years. And then we set up these norms and we expect the Chinese to observe them, right? So here again, I'm not telling you this is how I see it. This is how the Chinese see it. And Chinese kids are socialized in school as to how they were taken advantage of by the West, by the Japanese. during that 100 years. And we're never going to let that happen to us again. And, because the West stole from us, we can steal from the West, right? And that's why a lot of these individuals that you see coming up in these cases, they're actually pretty surprised for the most part when they get accused of being a spy, right? Because to their mind, they're just doing something in support of China, right? Of the Chinese people. So their motivation is something that we sit there and scratch our heads and say, how can you think this is not illegal? How can you think you're not going to go to jail for doing this? And they're like, well, I'm serving the motherland, right? Because from childhood on, they've been told what we've done to them. And from the Chinese perspective, this is our comeuppance, right? So we're paying the price now for that 100 years of shame for which we're blamed, right? So in any case, that's the very abbreviated version of, how the Chinese think about it. The other thing I want to emphasize is that they're unbelievably systematic. They are systematic like you can't even begin to imagine. So if you think about the millions of Chinese that live overseas Chinese, right? They're Huaqiao are ethnic Chinese people living overseas, and where they are and what they have access to, even in this country. People from the PRC don't come over here and study gender studies, all right? They're studying STEM, right? They have access to our technology. They have access to things that are of interest. And a lot of those things are targeted. And, they'll have like the hub of a wagon wheel, right? They'll have somebody who's gotten their US citizenship, who's working at a university, ethnic Chinese, but now they're a US person, right? But the thing is, they know what these students are studying, and that person may be reaching out to them and saying, hey, get me some information on this, get me some information on that, or, oh, take a job with this company, right? So there's a lot of reasons for concern. And I think this needs to be part of the conversation when you sit down and, pardon my French, but you want to scare the bejesus out of these agricultural companies and tell them, look, this is what the threat is, right? And then when you've got their attention, like you were saying, have folks that come in who understand the farming industry, right? And that are trustworthy, reliable partners, and not folks that are going to roll up in the newest Cadillac and say, oh yeah, $1 million, I'll take care of your problem for you. It's not going to work like that. But like I said, having a good understanding of the nature of the threat is job one.
No, we truly live in a flat world. Understand that. So I think we're at our time. Let's turn things over to some closing statements as we think about, again, kind of recapping our discussion on internal threats. Johnny, before we leave, any parting words that you want the audience to kind of resonate on before they move on to the next session?
Yeah, I think the big thing is take a look at what data you have and where it is, and just to start as a to-do going through and figuring out where it goes, right? Whether you're emailing it, how you're protecting it. That's a big one. And then as John mentioned, communicate when you find something, right? Don't think that it's just a blinking screen on your workstation. It's going to go away. It could be something more serious. So comms and just, know your posture. So hopefully that helps.
Thank you, Johnny. Fred, any parting words?
Yeah, just an observation from my years when I was working in the industry doing this is, getting folks to roger up and make an effort to put the money against the problem is the biggest challenge. Like I said, because in the commercial sector, now you're cutting into profit margins, right? So you've got to not only make clear to them what the threat is and let them know that they're in the, they're in the shot group for some insider threat and external threats as well, but to be able to make the next leap, which is here's how to address it, here's how to do it in a way that's not going to break the bank, and here's some reliable partners. I think if you're able to do that, you've got a recipe for success.
All right. Well, we want to thank our panelists today, Dr. Fred Hoffman and Johnny Collins, for helping us have a discussion on insider threats in the agricultural space and the ag technology space. We certainly want to thank F3 Tech for putting on this week's symposium. We know that this is going to spawn lots more discussions and opportunities for us to explore where technology and food and agriculture interface going forward. And we see our friend Andrew Rose here. Anything to add, Andrew, before we call it close for this session?
No, and I feel terrible that I had to miss most of the session here. I had to jump onto another call, but I was part of the pre-planning call, and I got, as a cyber geek, I got got very excited about this. So I can't wait to see the post recording of the event. And John, thank you for your stewardship as well.
Not
Yeah.
a problem.
Thanks, John. And thanks, gentlemen. This has been a great session.
All right. Thanks, Mike. Appreciate the time. Looking forward for the last session of the day.
Very good. Thanks.
Our
Take
pleasure,
care.
folks.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye now.
Bye.